Welcome back to part 2 of our conversation with Brigid about grief and everything that is involved with being a human. It's a great conversation. I can't wait for you to listen to the rest of it. If for any reason you're just jumping in now and haven't heard part 1, you can go back. It's already out, of course, any podcast player or on YouTube. You can find it all right there. I'm going to skip doing an intro and a hook and all that stuff that I normally do for a fresh episode because, well, this is part 2 of part 1. We're going to jump right into it. So here we go.
Yeah. And that's something that, everybody will have their own way of communicating what's going on. But I do encourage people, if you feel safe enough to do so, if someone has earned the right to hear your story, to share what you're going through. Because, if no one knows that you're experiencing a loss and you go excuse yourself and go to the walk-in freezer for 10 minutes, they're like, where's Brigid? Oh my God, we're not. But then if you're like, hey, I need a minute, and then you go to the walk-in, right. Then someone knows okay, I know what Brigid's going through. She's told me that she's taking a minute. I'm going to allow her that because, I have the context that's needed. Right. And not everyone's able to do that. It depends on how supportive your employer is. It oftentimes depends on how supportive your family members are. But if you have that opportunity to share a little bit of context of what you're going through, you will be surprised the number of people who want to support you and help you in any way that they can.
Yeah. And on the other side of that, I would offer up again to anybody listening who is in a position where you might have someone you work with, work for, or even related to that is going through some version of grief. And they do open up to you. They do take the risk to share, this is what I'm going through. I found from being on the sharer side of it and on the sharing side of it, either side of it, that sometimes if you don't know what it's like to have lost a parent or go through a significant change in your life or lose a job suddenly to a layoff or whatever, one of the best things you can say, I think, and I would love your insight on this, but for me, I found is if they've never been through it, they're like, look, I don't know what that's like, but I can tell for you, this is really hard and I'm here for it. Tell me more about what this is like. Because I think some of the more challenging things someone could say is, oh, you'll get through this. It's always the darkest before the dawn, or you can, we'll weather every storm. There's a lot of great cliches that are said that are meant to come from a good place. One of the ones that I almost punched someone in the face, this too shall pass. Mm. And yeah, I know that's a fact. I've lived long enough to know that it will, but that doesn't help me right now. I need to feel what I'm feeling. And I know the person said it in a way of trying to console and help. And I knew consciously enough to not get angry, but also recognize in the moment, yeah, that didn't help. And so really, I think being present and being honest about your side of it as a receiver, whether it is, I've never been through this, so I don't know, but I can tell it's a lot for you, so share more with me. Or if you've been through it, you can say, I don't know your exact experience. This is what it was like for me. Does that sound familiar? And because you're opening up that opportunity to be present with that person versus here's a little packaged saying that I heard once that's supposed to make you feel better. Yeah. So, that's, I would love your input on that, your thoughts on that.
Yeah. So I hold a certification. I'm trained in Brene Brown's Dare to Lead program, and that's where a lot of my, leadership stuff comes from. But she has a wonderful phrase that empathy is about sitting with someone in the darkness. It's not about rushing to turn on the light. Mm-hmm. And I think that a lot of us, while we mean well when we try to say things like, oh, look on the bright side, or everything happens for a reason. I think that is in part an effort on our end as the receiver to discharge that discomfort that we're feeling, because when someone shares that they've lost something or they're grieving something, that reminds us that we will lose things, that we are currently grieving things. And those are hard feelings to sit with, let alone sit with someone who is experiencing them. And so I really love what you said in terms of just saying, thank you for sharing with me. I don't understand exactly what you're going through. But the thank you alone almost acknowledges like, hey, you've shared something with me that you didn't have to share. Like, you have seen me as a person who is safe enough to offer this information to. And I want to honor that, because the other thing that I think people try to do is they try to relate and connect in some way. You know, if I don't remember what appointment I was at, but I said something along the lines of like, yeah, I lost my brother recently. And this girl was like, oh my gosh, I'm so sorry. I lost my cat. And I'm like, I don't deny that losing your cat was awful for you. Lord knows if I lost, like when I lose my cat, like that will destroy me. I already know that. She is my little baby. But just those are called empathy misses, right? It's a moment where you're trying to connect, but it comes off as, you know, making it about you, or it comes off as insensitive. And so sometimes the greatest gift you can give a griever is just allowing them to be exactly where they are.
But I add to that, then mentioning that your brother passed and someone's, so I lost my cat. The empathy miss. I found myself in a similar situation that it may not be an empathy miss, but often when I would share with people who didn't know my dad passed or didn't know other things that happened in my life had happened and that came up, and I had to then share with them, and that was the first they heard of it, they would then, oh, I'm so sorry, and they would do the natural thing, which is to share they are being empathetic and I'm sad for you. But I also then found myself at times, because I, in that moment, didn't want to deal with the grief or deal with, it's been 3 months since it happened and I'm kind of just trying to be in this space right now, enjoying this space. I found myself compelled to console them over my grief.
Yes.
And that was such a frustrating position to find myself in. And it became a compounded frustration, because then I got mad at myself because I'm like, well, they're just trying to be nice, Rick. Come on. They're just trying to show you that they care. Why do you got to be a jerk about it? But it was like, but I don't want to have to console them over my grief, you know? So is that a thing? Like, is that common?
That is 100% a thing. It's very common. And again, it goes back to us as human beings not wanting to sit in the discomfort. And I don't want to dismiss that in any sort of way, because, you know, we're neurologically hardwired to avoid discomfort. That was a survival mechanism for us. And so it's a natural response to see something that doesn't feel good and say like, oh, I want to keep my distance from that.
Right.
But, you know, one of the cliches is the only way out is through. And the other thing I like to sometimes think about is when we talk about emotion, I like to think of them as energy in motion, emotion that has to move. It has to go through. And so if you are feeling that like, ooh, you know, this hits too close to home, or I don't know what to say. So many people do say nothing because they're afraid of saying the wrong thing.
Yeah. And
I think that it's a valid instinct, but I think that you still want to make sure that you're reaching out in a way that acknowledges the other person, even by saying like, I don't know what you're going through, but I just want to let you know that you're on my heart, that I'm thinking about you. You know, a lot of people talk about after a loss, another thing that they grieve is they grieve relationships that they thought were different than what they become.
Mm-hmm.
You know, there are a lot of people who, when you are going through grief, because they themselves can't grapple with it or don't want to grapple with it, they back off, they distance themselves, they don't show up for you in the ways that you would have hoped that they would show up for you in times of grief. And you know, your higher self can maybe be like, oh, well, they're on their own journey, but that doesn't negate the pain that you feel that then adds to the grief. Like, not only are you grieving this one very substantive loss, but you're grieving so many secondary losses that kind of come with that, whether that be the loss of a support system, whether that be the loss of a particular community. Like, there are ripple effects in grief that we don't necessarily prepare ourselves for. Not that you can prepare yourself for grief whatsoever.
Well, yeah. But I think, if I may jump in real quick, I think we have an idea from society around us and the experiences we see others going through. We have an idea of what it must be like to lose a family member, what it must be like to get fired. Like, what would I do if that happened to me where I was fired, or the company just imploded and everyone was out of jobs? Or what if I went through a divorce? What would I do? What would that be like? And I think there's certain elements we can foreshadow, we can create a version that we believe might be reality. But one of the things I have found in my experiences of going through grief and talking to others, the biggest, oh, I didn't know that was a thing, is the grief of your identity. So going back to what you said, where it's like that portal shot you into a new timeline, that portal's now closed, you're on a new timeline, you can't ever go back. Part of that new timeline is your new identity. Whether you've lost a spouse or a parent or a sibling, you're no longer that person with that person in your life. You know, for example, my mom went from being married to being a widow. That is a new identity.
Yes.
That's a new form to fill out for taxes. That's a new box to check whenever you're filling stuff out. And that's the first time she's ever had to do that. And for me, I got laid off back in September. That was a new identity for me to go from being so attached to 25 years of being at this organization with a certain title, doing a certain thing every day, to now that is no longer what I do or who I am, or what do you do for work? What's your job? It's no longer that. And so there's that shift of identity that's part of the grief, because there's a subconscious part of you that grieves you're no longer that. Whether you liked it or not, whether you were comfortable with that title or not, there's still a grief process around that as part of the whole package, which I think, again, going back to, like, I think some people can kind of, I don't want to say fantasize, but like, you know, mentally prepare. What would I do if I was in that situation? What would it be like? But there are a lot of nuanced parts that you don't even think about that completely take you off guard. And you have to almost learn that about yourself as you're dealing with the emotions.
Yeah. I mean, it's, in terms of like the learning, grief is what kind of fast tracks that.
Yeah.
Because it's like, you don't have any other choice but to figure it out. There's no other option for you. Even in recovery spaces, that's something that people are taught when they go to rehab is, you know, you are going to have to grieve a lot of your past life because things are not going to show up in the same way that they did. So it goes back to that definition of grief being that natural, normal response to any change. And every change is going to look different, and therefore every grief is going to look different. And the way that you integrate each loss and each change is going to look different.
Yeah. Yeah. So I want to, well, there's two more things I definitely want to cover. So we're going to come back to this one, and we'll go. And there's a method to my madness, just so I don't forget.
Let's do
I
it.
want to talk the second one first, real quick. I want to discuss with you the process you help people walk through when you, because it's coaching and therapy are different, obviously, and you're trained differently as a coach versus a therapist. Both are very valuable things to have in your life. I've had therapists and coaches. I've had multiple therapists because everyone has their skill set, and it's important to learn these things about ourselves and have the right people in those positions. So I do want to come to eventually some of the things you would help as a coach. What is it that you offer and do for people dealing with loss and grief? Not only in what we've talked a lot about, which is family members or, the human side of it, but also I want to bring it back to the animal care side, because I think there's an element of grief that is rarely discussed. As you experience, you have 3 to 5 days, or have I experienced, you say goodbye to an animal, you turn around, and you're doing a presentation the next moment. And there was never, in my experience, and I don't think it was out of callousness. I think it was more out of just, this is how it's always been done. And so this is how we deal with it, is by not dealing with it. It's part of the job. These aren't your animals anyways. The animals belong to the facility you work for. You're hired to take care of them. And so you're kind of just pushed through the process of, I'm caring for them and I'm not supposed to grieve and not be sad. And the people that you work for tend to be older than you. So they come from a generation that even it was more callous and cold, and that's how they were trained to deal with it. And so that's the only thing they know to train you to deal with. So I want to also then not only end on talking about what you offer up as a coach and how you work with people, but I want to jump first into the animal care side of it, and recognizing a lot of the audience that we have for this podcast and your experience also comes from the animal side of things, where many of us go to work day in and day out, year after year. We say goodbye to an animal, and we have to figure out some version of paying a tribute, of having a grieving moment, of whatever that might be. And every facility is different too on what they allow for social media, what they want released or not released. Some facilities, they themselves will hold a social media posting about, please leave your comments and what this animal meant to you. Others, the animal passes, you'd act like they were never there. All of us have different experiences with this on the animal care side of stuff. So those in the animal care world, I would like to ask you, what's the best thing we can do? I mean, we did talk about making space for it, give yourself those 10 minutes, but what would be some of the avenues you could explore when you do have to clock in the next day after an animal passes and clean out their cage and clean out their bedding and wash their dishes for the last time and prep the habitat for a new animal that's got to go in there, because we can't have empty habitats?
Yeah, I'm really glad that you brought this up. So back in 2023, there was a study done in partnership with the Denver Zoo and Colorado State University. Okay. And they looked at burnout, mental health, and grief in terms of animal care professionals, and specifically people in the zoo and aquarium industry, because there's very limited research on animal care workers in particular. There are some things that we know. We know that veterinarians have a higher rate of suicide than the average occupation. We know that people that work in animal shelters develop PTSD at 5 times the national average. We know some of those things, but that's a very broad scope. And there's some about working at a zoo and aquarium that is very niche. And one of the things that this study found was that resilience is correlated with what they call perceived organizational support. And that is, how does your specific facility support through this grief process? And it's perceived, right? Like someone in HR could be like, oh my gosh, we have all of these great things. But if that's not landing for a person, they're not going to perceive that they have support. And so a lot of this has to come from kind of operational changes to a certain extent. But one of the things that there were 2 things that people requested more of. They requested more communication, whether that be communication on how an animal's doing after a transfer, because that's its own loss. And
right? Yeah.
A lot
animal
of times
moves.
an animal moves and it's like, okay, bye. But people have a relationship with that animal. They wonder how that animal's doing. They wonder, and it falls on the person to be like, let me friend someone on Facebook who's a keeper
Yeah.
at this other zoo that keeps, that actually works with this animal so that I can message them every once in a while. So that's something that an organization can do, is an organization can actually be both proactive in their communications around losses, but also be more communicative and bring people into the fold in terms of what, and I understand that like every facility is different. There are different hierarchies. You probably aren't going to feasibly be able to take everyone's input into account. Like that's just the world of animal management, right? Like some decisions have to be made. There's this idea of horizon conflict where if you're higher up on the ladder, you see a wider horizon. There's different things that you have to take into account when making decisions that maybe like an intern or a volunteer doesn't have visibility into. So I do want to honor that. But an organization can certainly be more communicative in even acknowledging that these are losses and that it's going to affect people. And then the other thing that has shown to directly correlate with resilience is ritual. Mm-hmm. And that is something that, yes, it's great if an organization can do it on their own, but that's something that we ourselves can cultivate. If that means that you take a minute to, say like to touch the door of the enclosure and say like, I loved this animal. I shared so many good moments with this animal. And just like maybe every time you walk into that enclosure, you touch that door as a reminder of like, hey, I remember the last animal that was in here and how much I love this animal. Being able to ritualize grief is a way that helps our brain integrate that into our everyday life. And that is what helps us become more resilient. So those are two of the things that the study showed can have a really great impact.
Yeah. And the ritual side of it, I think, is important for us as humans. Mm-hmm. And it's funny how many people in the animal care world can recognize things like elephants having their ritual or orcas having their rituals around the passing of a member of the pod or the herd. But we don't give ourselves that same acknowledgement. Now, albeit there are those that do have an understanding of rituals around death, but sometimes it's reserved only for humans. Mm-hmm. Whether it's a funeral process or a wake or whatever spiritual or religious beliefs they may have, give them those rituals. But I really like how you said that, whether it's figuring out, okay, I'm going to touch the door and say some words, and then every time I walk by this door, or whatever it might be, I think there's such great value in honoring the memories, honoring the connection through a simple ritual. And at first, sometimes it can feel awkward or painful because there's a lot of sadness involved with that. But I do believe it's part of that process, whatever that ritual might be for each individual. It could be, there's so many different versions of it. And I don't think there's any right way or wrong way to what you said earlier. It's as long as you're not hurting anybody or yourself, it's the right way.
Yeah.
So I love that you brought that up, because I think it's something that's of value to share with those, especially those who might be experiencing loss for the first time in the workplace of an animal that they've had a partnership with or connection to, or you are witnessing someone going through that and you see them do a version of their ritual. Have some grace for them, and honor that that's what they need, and that they'd be happy that they found that, because sometimes from the outside, we don't understand what someone else is processing or how they're processing. So I really thankful that you brought that up.
Yeah. And 2 points. One is understanding that what you need is not what someone else needs.
Right.
There are some people who really need a hug, and there are some people who are like, please don't touch me at all.
Right.
And so understanding that people are going to need different things at different times, and allowing space for that. But also the importance of ritual comes in as you get further and further away from that loss event, because that's one of the things that we grieve, is we grieve that time as it gets wider and wider between life with that thing and life without that thing.
Yeah.
And having a ritual around that loss can instantly help you reconnect to that thing. And you can draw on that ritual for years to come. You can reconnect with that thing that you love for years to come through that act of ritual. And so not only does it serve you in the very acute grief in that moment, but that will continue to serve you down the line.
Absolutely. And that goes to also what we briefly touched on earlier is animal moves. That is a unique experience of grief, I think, in the business of animal care, in that zoos and aquariums and other like facilities often will move animals around for population management or for breeding purposes, genetic diversity within the zoos. And we can rationalize that this needs to happen. It's important for the species or for the individual. Sometimes it may not seem like it's justified enough to the individual caretaker, but to your point, someone higher up on the ladder sees a different horizon. So I think having those rituals around the loss and recognizing the grief around the loss of an animal that isn't gone from the planet, but is gone from your life for whatever reason. And with that, to go back real quick, what you mentioned, I do agree completely. Those that are at a different area of management or volunteer or somewhere in between, caretaker or CEO, that position on the ladder offers them a different, broader view or a little more of a narrow view. I would like to think that anybody listening now who's working their way up that ladder remembers that even if you do have that higher view and the broader horizon with more things to think about than someone who doesn't see the bigger picture like you do, that you remember what it was like to be down lower on the ladder, to have that narrow view, so you are motivated to communicate what the bigger view looks like and understand their perspective, not just demand that they understand yours. That's where I think a lot of facilities fall short, is that as people work up and they get that broader view, they can see it, it makes sense, but they don't communicate it back down so it can make sense for others, because it's part of the community. It's part of the process for helping everyone understand. And they might still argue back and say it's a bad decision or the wrong choice, but it's an opportunity for that communication you're talking about to happen and to allow for the grief process, even for an animal move, to hopefully land a little better, or at least allow that person to process their grief in a new way that might be a little bit helpful.
Yeah. And that's part of what makes a strong team is
Yeah.
when you understand and have a shared why.
Yeah.
You might not agree with the why, but and that's part of animal training, right? Like I
Right.
might train an animal a different way than someone else does, but if I know the why, that helps me adapt to what the animal's doing and allows me to be like, all right, well, my end goal is this because we got to get him into this med pool by, the end of the day. So I will adjust my approach, but everybody knows why we're doing the thing. And that is what creates cohesion.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, that's great. And so in the process of answering the first part of that question, you did start to go into that second part. As with that coach hat on, with that knowledge you have, the training you've had, what are some of the things that if I were to get on your website and say, okay, here's my contact information, I want to work with you, or I'm thinking about working with you, what are some of the things that you would offer up? What are some of the tools and process? You mentioned there's the group thing that you have for those that have lost family members to suicide. Let's say I am a zoo person or an aquarium person, and I'm just struggling with the loss of an animal or whatever it might be, or maybe it's a compounded thing because as we get older, we lose all sorts of things. Grief happens for a wide variety of ways. What are some of the tools and avenues and things you offer up as a coach? So if there's someone listening to this is like, I think this might be for me, tell us a little more about what to expect if they were to reach out to you.
Yeah. So I have a signature course that I call the Death Card Collective, and that is an 8-week course that I run twice a year. It includes part workshops and then part like group coaching together. But the reason I named it the Death Card Collective is because in a tarot deck, there's the Death card. And most people, if they pull that card, they freak out. They mean someone's going to die. But actually, the whole point of the Death card is to remind us that death is a part of the cycle of life and that we are not separate from that. And it is about kind of what we talked about earlier, this idea of the release and the letting go in order to nourish, to compost, and to grow the next new thing. And so that's a very easy kind of access point to work with me and connect with other people. Because again, that's one of the really important elements of grief and loss and change is having a community of like-minded people who understand. So you can always go to my website, literallyworkingthroughit.com, and sign up for the wait list for when doors open for the next cohort. The other thing that I work with people on, and this is what lights my animal trainer brain up, is I work with people on cultivating hope, because I base this off of the research of C.R. Snyder, who found that hope is not an emotion. Hope is a cognitive process, and a cognitive process can be strengthened. So I say it all the time. Hope is a learned behavior. And so how do you learn a behavior? You break it down into small approximations. So there are 3 elements of hope, and there are 3 pillars that are all equally important. The first one is setting realistic goals, because you have to have something to work towards, but it also can't be something that's completely overwhelming. So right. I work with people a lot on the framing of SMART goals. So, you know, if you've done any sort of coaching in the industry, you know what a SMART goal is. Specific, measurable, attainable, relevant, and time-bound. And all of those elements act as a check and balance. I like to think of goals as, those small goals in particular, as stepping stones that get you across a river. You're not going to leap the river all at once, you know, and you also don't want the stones to be so far apart that you're like, oh, I don't know if I can make that one. So setting realistic goals, breaking bigger goals down into smaller ones, is an essential part of the cognitive process of hope. The next one is staying flexible, because life happens. If there's anything that grief and loss teaches us, it is that anything can happen at any time. And so being able to stay flexible is a big part in being able to adapt in order to reach those goals that you've set. And then the third pillar of hope, which is the kicker that we do a lot of work on, is believing in yourself. Believing that you can achieve those goals. And so what are the things that contribute to believing in yourself, to contributing to self-esteem? So sometimes we work on defining personal values, because our values act as our North Star. And so how do we make decisions from a place of authenticity if we don't know what we stand for, if we don't know what's important to us? Another element of self-esteem is setting boundaries. And you use your values to inform what boundaries you need to set. You have to know what's important to you in order to know where you need to stand up for yourself or for others. And then another important part of self-esteem is self-talk. How do you communicate with yourself? Not only just verbally, because actually verbal communication is really only 7% of all communication. So how do you show yourself care? Because how you treat yourself, how you talk to yourself, predicates how you care for yourself. And so everybody's going to need different emphasis on different elements, but those 3 pillars of hope are something that I love working with people on, because it is so tangible, right? And grief and loss and change feel intangible. And
yeah,
so
and I think that's part of the challenge of reckoning with it, is it does feel so intangible. So I can absolutely see how this structure, okay, now I have something I can grab onto and start focusing on. That's awesome. Keep going though. I'm just like, oh yeah. Definitely.
No, yes. So those are the 3 pillars. And a lot of times like that is enough for people to find their footing after the tornado has come and blown through their life. And that is how you build resilience and start having faith in yourself, because that's about knowing that you can handle things because you've handled them before.
Right.
And so it's just, I always say that not that my brother's death was easier than my father's death, but that grief was more familiar. And I had done enough work to know more of who I was and how I wanted to show up. And that gave me the confidence to give myself what I needed in that grief period. So, I love talking about how hope is a learned behavior because, I miss training. So, who knows?
But
maybe one of these days
though.
I'll bust out a clicker in a coaching session.
But I think that's a big part of so I spent several years mentoring and coaching in the goal setting realm of career and life changes, whether it's college to career to retirement. And I found the same thing where it is, everything we learn as animal trainers and behavior and goals and shaping behavior and understanding habitual behavior and how you can shift it through these little steps and, the small stepping stones, small little goals to get to the big one, approximations. It's all the same for people or for working with animals.
We are animals.
Oh my gosh. Yeah.
We don't want to think that we're animals, but we are animals. We are not separate from any of this.
Well, and I will say this too, is again, reflecting back on my experiences with grief, sometimes too, when you're in it, you forget to call on your knowledge of behavior, of habit setting, of goal setting, because you mentioned earlier, it's like this tornado, this whirlwind of an experience, and you get disoriented and your life doesn't feel like your own all of a sudden. And, one thing I remember reading about being in that survival mode mind and knowing what I know about fight or flight in animal care is that because the adrenaline, because the mentality of I could die if I don't do this, your mind, for survival purposes, your mind purposely focuses only on the immediate threat. So the example I was always given was you're being chased by a cave bear as, this person from hundreds of thousands of years ago. You're going to run across the thicket and thorns and your feet are going to get bloody, but you're not going to feel it or care because you're surviving getting away from the bear. And then afterwards, when you come down out of that single focus fear, you'll be like, oh, my feet are a mess, and now I got to take care of that, and now I got to deal with that. But because you can only focus on the one thing, I know going through grief was similar in the sense of you're swirling in that level of emotion. It was hard for me to step out of just focusing on that emotion and those challenges and go, wait a minute, I have the knowledge and skills about habits and behaviors and goals and stepping stones. And it was hard at first, but I was working with somebody which allowed for me to be reminded of that and to help me go, oh yeah, thanks for holding up that sign saying, no, you want to do this first. And the reason I bring that up in my experience is because I want others to hear too the value in what you offer. As a coach, as a group coaching program, I really think there is value in, even if I know behavior, I know myself, there are times where you get wrapped up, you get pulled into this tornado of emotions, and all of your knowledge and skill does not matter because your mind becomes singularly focused. And having someone on the outside of that storm coach you through the process can reignite your knowledge. And you're like, oh yeah, I can do this. And that pillars of hope and that concept of giving something tangible, I think there's such value in helping someone through the process of grief and understanding themselves in grief, because it's that little sign off in the distance going, nope, just reach a little bit further to the right and you'll be fine, and I just think it's wonderful that you're doing this for others. And the part that I really appreciate about what this brings for my audience is that I do know there's a lot of us in the animal care world and even the conservation side. Yes, we're trained on the conservation side and even in the zoo world it's science. You're not getting emotionally involved. Classic Jane Goodall. Oh, we give the chimpanzees numbers. And she's like, no, they get names.
Yeah.
Because they're entities, they're personalities, they get names. But even though that was the 60s and 70s with Jane Goodall when she broke that mold, about naming animals instead of giving them numbers, it's still a thing in the world today where it's like you have to have some sort of emotional distance, and you shouldn't be like that. You
Don't
shouldn't feel that way.
anthropomorphize. Yeah.
Yeah. And so I just think it's a great value of what you're doing and allowing us to have these conversations. I can't thank you enough for taking the time to be on here, but is there anything else we haven't touched on yet that you think would be of value for my audience?
Well, one thing just to talk about, because you brought up the metaphor of running from the bear, which I use that all the time, especially when I work with people through burnout, because that's something that is really important for us to recognize, is that we are constantly getting activated in terms of the stress response cycles. Mm-hmm. And so we have to be completing those cycles. Running from the bear told your body, I have run from the bear and I am now safe. But we don't have that in today's day and age. Like our stress response gets activated because of a project deadline, because of traffic, because of in-laws. And like maybe you find a different way to work and you avoid the traffic, but that hasn't told your body anything. And so being able to complete stress response cycles is also an important part of that grieving process, is being able to tell your body in some sort of way, like, we have discharged, we are back, like, let's bring it back into a parasympathetic state. So I'm really glad that you said that. And the other thing that I just want to caveat with when we talk about goals, I first want to acknowledge that, like, sometimes we don't have the energy to set goals, and that's okay. That's part of the allowing. And also a goal can be, I'm going to take a shower today.
Yeah, absolutely.
I'm going to take the dog for a walk today. That is how things get accomplished, is in that mindset of small goals only. Yeah. Because the small is all. It is the performing of small actions that creates the whole. Yeah. And so that's something that I want people to keep in mind, is even when you're setting a goal, it doesn't matter what that goal is, as long as it feels like you can accomplish it and that you can do it again, because that's all you do with grief, is just what is the next right thing that I have to do. And eventually you'll turn behind and you'll see, like, wow, I've traveled a long way. I didn't feel like it in the moment, but I actually have.
Yeah, I will add to that, because it's such a great point, that sometimes just thinking about working with somebody on goals is like, well, I don't have the capacity to even do these big goals. I know I want to do them, but because now I'm going to be held accountable for it, and someone's going to be yelling at me. And you so good about saying that. Thank you for saying that. That often when that first conversation happens with the coach, it's like, look, I want to get, and you use this example earlier, I want to get to that side of the river. And so the first question from the coach isn't like, well, then get swimming, go, go, go. Yeah. It's, let's figure out how to get that first stepping stone in place. And maybe that is our goal. And first part of that goal is look around and see what kind of things could be stepping stones. And that's all you got to do today. Mm-hmm. And that takes so much pressure off the bigger goal of, I got to figure out how to get across the river today. And the analogy I would use often, because one of the biggest things that helped me through a lot of processing of grief and anxiety was getting outside for a walk. There's something about just being outside, changing your environment briefly. And again, as an animal person, I know changing environments can change animals' behavior completely. But for myself, I was like, one of the biggest ones was, if the goal is to go out for a walk, you want to do 15-minute walk every other day. Start with that, okay? But the idea of getting up and going out and going for a walk, getting off the couch, getting the motivation, saying, okay, well, your very first goal is to just stand up and grab your keys and put your shoes on. And if that's as far as you want to go, take your shoes off, put your keys down, and go sit back on the couch. But once we got that going, that concept of, like, just grab the keys and put your shoes on. You don't have to say, open the door. Well, if your shoes are already on, what if you did open the door? And now your next thing is approximate to the front walk, and eventually it's a lot less overwhelming when you can break it down into those small little easily obtainable steps, because then the next step is also small and easy and attainable. So thank you for bringing that up. I think there's great value in that. And especially for somebody hearing that Just because you're going to be working with a coach doesn't mean you have to jump in and get yelled at to do all these things all at once.
I'm not a yeller. Sorry.
But I think a lot of people have that concept of coaching is like, you're going to ride me and harass me. Like, it's like, no, we're going to find out what works for you and we're going to approximate those things. So that's great. That's great. Well, again, I cannot thank you enough. And you were kind enough, for anyone listening, you were kind enough to also send me the link to that study you mentioned in our conversation. So I will have your information in the show notes below, whether people are watching this on YouTube or listening on a podcast player. I'll also have the links you provided to that study about people in zoos and burnout. I think that's very important. And I think anybody listening who wants to learn more, just because you reach out to Brigid doesn't mean you have to work with her or hire as a coach, but I think there's a wealth of information, knowledge, and resources that you could find by further exploring this. So I encourage anybody who might be wanting to learn more, go ahead and reach out to her. I think you'll be pleasantly surprised.
Yeah, I'll talk with anyone about anything.
There you go. Perfect.
Just shoot me a DM. I just want to get to know you. Let's do it.
Excellent. Excellent. Well, again, Brigid, thank you so much for taking the time to be on Animals, Nature, and You, and for sharing your wealth of knowledge with everyone.
Thank you so much, Rick. This has been a treat.
And of course, thank you, dear listeners. I appreciate you being here and joining me on this curious odyssey we call Animals, Nature, and You. I really hope you got something out of this conversation around grief and everything else. Really is a focus on the you part of Animals, Nature, and You. I know for me, and before I started this podcast, getting out in nature, whether it was a walk in the green space, going out in the park, or just watching the birds outside, any version of reconnecting with animals and nature helped me so much through the many challenges that occurred over the last 5 years of my life before this podcast was even thought of as being a thing. And that is part of the reason why it is named what is named. Animals, Nature, and You. There's a connection there. There's a through line there. If you work with animals, you work in nature, you work around the space of living things, or you even have a pet at home, we're going to come across the emotions of grief at some point or another. And whether animals and nature help us through that process, or the process has brought on the fact that we had animals in our life that passed away, or any version of that, this conversation is so valuable. And whether you reach out to Brigid for her coaching or her knowledge around this, or you explore it on your own, or you have a therapist, or you work through grief counseling, whatever it might be, there's value in understanding yourself and the elements that grief offer, and have the lessons you learn about yourself while going through that process, and allowing yourself to go through that process. So thank you very much for being a part of this conversation. We have so many different dynamic conversations, whether it was from several episodes ago where we talked about pet therapy, or even before that talking about how humans are so powerful when they work together from different cultures for conservation, or whether we're talking about the understanding of how love works into the equation of conservation, like we did a couple episodes ago with Leif. There's just so much to it. And then even the Mothering Wildlife with Elizabeth Johnson, talking about that balancing of work and life, and really that it's more than just work and life, but it's work as a component of life, which is made up of many other things as well. It all comes together. We are all connected. We're connected to animals. We're connected to nature. We're connected to each other. And I just love the fact we can have these conversations. So if you haven't already, make sure you hit subscribe or follow. Make sure you're a part of this community. We have new episodes coming out every Thursday, interviews like this with awesome guests doing awesome work that is important and challenging and cool and interesting. And then also every Tuesday, we have our 10-Minute Tuesdays, which is just a shorter version of me taking a solo episode, talking about either something we have discussed with a guest from the past, or something that's topical in the moment. If you want to connect, you can find Animals, Nature, and You on Instagram, or you can look down in the show notes below, find my website, zoologyrick.com. You can find all of the information of our guests and the stuff we talked about down there as well, and also my social media too. So with that, we're going to wrap this up, and I will say what I always say because I mean it. Have a good one, everybody.